in the area of individual or personal resilience already building, in the area of community resilience, and very little, if anything, in the area of organizational resilience, which is the reason why Erica, a key reason why Erica decided to work in this area and then recruited me and a range of other people. 10 case studies spread across the country that included a regional council, a large manufacturer, a tertiary institution, a small IT support organization, 10 organizations spread across size, the nation geographically, and in terms of sector that they were functioning in. And what did we learn from that? Well, we learned a number of key things. One of the key things that we learned was that this whole idea of resilience wasn't just about disasters. Although what you did read in the literature that existed, it probably all sat right in the disasters and risk management space. We found that it was actually very multidimensional. It was having impacts on organizations' performance, their financial performance, in a day-to-day basis. That it was about the technology, but it was also about the people. And we came up with a set of 24 indicators that we thought would tell us about an organization's resilience. From there, we went to the Auckland study, which was conducted by Amy Stevenson. And Amy created a survey to see, could we measure resilience? Because one of the things that we found in practice is that organizations control the things they measure. The things they measure, they tend to be fluffy about and probably don't control very well. And so we thought, if we can measure this in some fashion, and it's useful, we might well be able to begin to make a real impact on organizations' resilience, rather than just talking in fluffy terms about what resilience was. And so this study included 64 organizations, again, quite broad, manufacturing, service, public sector, private sector, small, large, but a larger number, randomly selected from Auckland. And from that, we found that actually that 24 indicators, many of them actually coalesced onto, because now we had data, statistical data, rather than just qualitative, we had some quantitative data. And in the process of working with that data, we found really there weren't 4 categories as we had surmised, or 3 categories, or different categories, but we narrowed it down to a couple of categories and 13 indicators, not 24 indicators. That took us to the next stage for us, really, which was a resilience model to help us think more deeply. We could start looking at particular elements. So out of that study came the 13 indicators around the outside of this model. Some of you be familiar with our model, some not. So leadership, staff engagement, decision-making, situation awareness, partnerships, resources, breaking silos, leveraging what we already know, having a unity of purpose, planning strategies and testing those plans, being proactive, being innovative, creative, learning. Those were the key things. The inside of this model really didn't come out of Amy's study. That came out of an ongoing collaboration with the Australian Attorney General's Office and the Resilient Expert Advisory Group that is in Australia that Erica sits on. And we've worked with them to group these in a way that would provide something we could communicate effectively to others. What else have we done? Well, there was this body of work. Suzanne Wilkinson, who was mentioned by Eric at the beginning, runs a research group at the University of Auckland, primarily in the area of post-disaster reconstruction. What does that look like? Can we do it better than we do right now? What you're looking at here is one of their early studies. This was a study on the great 2007 Great Chinese Earthquake, in which there were tens of thousands of people killed and thousands of building collapses. This is only one example of it. And one of her PhD students, who was Chinese, had direct access back into that community. This particular one, Sonia Giovanazzi was involved with. Sonia, are you here? Yes. This is a photo I took on a visit to L'Aquila, which is a city in the Apennines in Italy, an old city, a medieval city that was devastated by an earthquake in 2009. So the year before the Christchurch earthquake. This one is the Black Saturday bushfires in Australia that killed so many people, just wiped out complete communities. And Suzanne and her team, and Erica's been involved with that, have been there, I think, 4 times now. And so it's a continuing study of the recovery of that community, has reconstruction worked? Where has it failed? What can we learn from that? A huge amount. Many of you recognize the high-vis vest, which had been high fashion in Christchurch after the earthquakes. And there's been an ongoing series of studies. I think we're up at 6, 7, 8 studies around the reconstruction in Christchurch. We've looked at how do we supply the necessary employees to keep the rebuild going? How do we house them? What are the bottlenecks to that reconstruction? How do we build what we're doing better? Been a number that have been involved with studies with SCIRT. And so quite a lot of work, but all of this has really tended to coalesce around this idea of reconstruction and resilience and build back better, which is a turn of phrase used in the reconstruction area that says, don't just build what you've already done before. That broke too easily already. Let's invest the extra 10%, 20%, whatever it might be, and make sure that it is more solid, more resilient, delivering a better service, a better quality, maybe a better volume. In some ways, it was touched on by Rob Jameson in the video. He talked about when you're building for growth, build in higher resilience, not just growth. So creating that resilience as you go in your day-to-day business. And so what are some of the learnings that have come out of this? Well, there are a number of key learnings. One of them probably shouldn't be too surprising, and that is that many of the issues that we've seen in Christchurch, the Christchurch rebuild, have happened before. Many things that aren't new. There's also some things that are new that we've learned. One of the things that we've seen very little of in the literature is the fact that the state of, although it's common sense, the state of the community and its economy has a big impact on the recovery and the rebuild. It isn't, there isn't some magic. So if the economy is depressed beforehand, there's poor insurance, and they don't have a lot of resources, the recovery and the rebuild are probably going to struggle a fair amount. And certainly we've seen this in Haiti and other disaster-hit countries. If you've got really good insurance, in spite of the problems that we've had with insurance, and a lot of us have had to live with that personally, in the end, we're going to have a fabulous stock of new buildings and new houses in another 2, 3, 5, 10 years. That'll stand our city in good stead for the next 100 years. So that taking in the larger context, looking at it systemically, is something that we've learned. Also, some of the common responses to addressing building safety in terms of changes in codes. So in Christchurch, we've seen a change in our code. This is a relatively common response post-earthquake. So some of the things we've learned are we're ticking the box and saying, that's right, how can we do it better? This has been involved, this series of studies has involved a range of organizations, some supporting financially, others supporting through access. And these are some of them here. Brands is the building industry group, ourselves, of course, University of Canterbury and the University of Auckland, the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment providing funding, same thing with EQC, and the Natural Hazards Research Platform. So Erica mentioned earlier, the work that we do is multidisciplinary, multi-institutional, because we think this problem is both too important and too hard for an individual discipline or an individual organization to really make real progress. What else have we been doing? Well, you saw the slide before. What about the earthquakes in Christchurch? What sort of studies have we done? Let me talk about a few of those. This particular study was a study by Chikiwe Kuchali looking at sectoral resilience. So we did a survey of about 1,000 organizations from 10 different sectors or slices through the economy. And what you're looking at here is a food warehouse that supplies the supermarkets. And one of the things she looked at was the interdependencies between different economic sectors. And here in particular, we're looking at fast-moving consumer goods. We're looking at trucking. We were looking at the roading, and all of three which were part of our study, and the interrelationships between them and the city council, which was also part of our study in terms of the infrastructure side. And so we saw some significant insights. One of those is that an economy is a complex adaptive system, and we need to treat it like that. You can't just build a model, put some numbers in, and hope you're going to get a really good result out the other end. Because of the complexity of the system, we need to think about that complexity. We need to think about the people and how these components interact with one another. Not an easy thing to think about. You can sort of twist your brain into various angles. But we did learn some critical things about feedback loops and where should you start with your recovery, which aspects to build support for other parts. Then we had Zach Whitman's study, which was on rural New Zealand. Okay, that's the reason for green. You see the trace fault running through a farmer's field there from the September 4th earthquake. And what Zach looked at was comparing the impact of the earthquakes on farms and non-farm rural organizations. So that would be their suppliers in small towns and their contractors and so forth. And he made a comparison between the impact on the Canterbury farm and non-farm rural organizations with the Southland, who'd been hit the month after the first earthquake in Christchurch. They were hit by 1 in 100-year snow, huge impact in Southland from the snow, comparing the resilience of those communities and the recovery of those farm and non-farm organizations. And probably a key finding was the criticality of social capital. Now, this term social capital, widely used in the community resilience space, almost unheard of in the organizational and business space. And yet Zach found that it was a crucial element to the recovery of these farms and their non-farm support organizations. Another study, one by Jo Stevenson, who has just completed her PhD. She did a study on 32, we just put up some pictures there, but 32 organizations. They were centralized in 3 locations. About 12 of them, I think, were from the Christchurch CBD, 9 or 10 of them were from the Kaipoi Town Center, and 9 or 10 from the Littleton Town Center. Because we wanted to look at, did it make a difference where you were located? If you were located in the worst place, worst possible, and those 3 locations were worst hit at different aspects at different times. Kaipoi hit very badly 4th of September, not so much from the 22nd of February. Littleton, the exact opposite result, and Christchurch hit by both. Did it matter where you were located, and what were the things that caused you to recover the most quickly? Joanne coined the phrase relational resilience as being the most critical thing for the business recovery. It was more important than their financial state, more important than their insurance or the finances they had support, although that was important too. But their relational resilience, the resilience as a consequence of their connections, of those business people's connections with people in their community, with other businesses, with their friends and family. These are the things that made the biggest difference. And actually, this was supported in many ways by the first well-being survey that was done by Sarah in 2012, I think, early 2012. So this relational resilience of social capital coming through is quite an important feature. Also, one of the things that we found quite interesting was that the worst hit organizations often were doing the best in terms of the recovery. We'll talk a little bit more about that with this next study. Now, I've given you a very quick gloss over the surface with a couple. I'm going to go a little bit deeper, not too much because of constraints of time, but this is a study Tracy Hatton is doing, and she's conceptualized this as a game of snakes and ladders. How many of you are familiar with that game? Yeah, most of you probably are. The study involved 24 businesses. So we talked about the survey work that we've done. We've also done lots of case studies, trying to find out what's happening underneath the surface. 22 of them are quite small, 2 larger organizations, right across a range of sectors. Degree of damage, 16 of them completely lost their premises, so that was the majority of them. So quite significant. Current status, 18 have resumed trading, 6 are not trading. So what does that mean? If we look at recovery trajectory, many of these organizations, of course, said we don't really want to play this game of snakes and ladders right now, which is really a game of recovery from the earthquake. And there's snakes biting you and preventing you from getting ahead, and ladders helping you get on top of things. What might that look like? Well, you have an earthquake, and this is what we would usually think will happen. Organizations stop trading, then they resume. They may just be surviving. They may continue to improve and return to their pre-earthquake state, and then they may continue to move on and thrive, there'll be some organizations that will stop at each of these places. One of the things that we found, of course, and that you would perhaps assume is not trading means they've ceased. This is the assumption. Or that if they've resumed and just survived, they may also not succeed because they're just barely eking out an existence. One of the things that we found that was surprising that Tracy's found and shared with us is this. Many organizations, well, a reasonable number, weren't trading. They weren't trading. They weren't trading. All of a sudden, they reopen and they're thriving like crazy, much better than they were beforehand. That's not something we find in the literature. That's something new, unusual. And another aspect from this, so some of the snakes, some of the unexpected things, aftershocks, the detailed engineering tests that had to be done. So we thought a whole bunch of buildings along Rickerton Road, they're fine, right? All of a sudden they get the detailed engineering statements done and they find actually they have to close because they're earthquake threatened. So you've got these unexpected things. Are there any antidotes to it? Yes, and you saw in our model, situation awareness. Being aware that in earthquakes you usually get aftershocks, and that's not an uncommon thing. And the state of buildings isn't just on the surface, it's what's under the surface. And also some of the other things like community effects. Your building's fine, your location's great, but half the others are closed. And so anybody who drives past thinks you're closed as well. Another one, insurance. Lots of our businesses had insurance. Unfortunately, some of them couldn't access that insurance because their building wasn't damaged. If they had business continuity insurance, is the term we use, if they weren't physically damaged, they didn't get any of their insurance. They got no payout, typically, because that's usually the clause that triggers the insurance, even though they weren't getting any business because they were inside the cordon, or they weren't getting any business because of damaged buildings around them. Is there something that you could do about it? Is there an antidote to that? Well, a partial antidote, at least, is a booklet that we created with Charlotte Brown's help on Cover Your Assets, okay, which is about insurance, how you can make sure that your insurance is going to work for you in a disaster setting. Another snake, rapid and steep rise in rents. We saw this dramatically happen in Christchurch. Is there any antidote to that? Well, yeah, new ways of working, new ways of locating. We had lots of businesses co-locate, in some cases with competitors, some cases synergistically with someone who had a complementary type of business to help them overcome both the shortage and the steep rent rises. What were some of the ladders? Well, a key ladder, thinking, was the government. In particular, based on survey work that we've done, case studies we've done, and other work that's been done by other researchers, the earthquake support subsidy was, without question, head and shoulders above the rest of the things, steps the government took to make a difference, to maintain the population, to get businesses back up, retain employment, retain the relationship between the employer and the employees so people would stay, so employers would reopen. There was a whole lot of synergism happening there. Other things, though, we had Recover Canterbury as an example of collaboration between two local economic development groups. Enterprise North Canterbury, role modeling of organizations to help others, all important features. Another ladder in the private sector was the combination of sharing ideas, sharing locations, providing support to competitors. This whole aspect, usually of social capital. You knew them beforehand. You were friends beforehand, but maybe friendly competitors. Finding the silver lining was a major outcome from this study, because often when we think about disasters, we think about recovery, which is just getting rid of the bad stuff. That's what we tend to think about. Let's get rid of the bad stuff and get back to where we were. But in many cases, we actually have an opportunity to improve the social capital, to retain that positive support that we find in the weeks and months immediately following a disaster. Creativity, creative ideas. One of the things we found both from this study and from Joanne Stevenson's study is the worst hit organizations tended to do much better because they thought either I'm going to, if I'm going to survive, I'm going to have to adapt. I'm going to have to innovate. Once they started on that path of innovation and adaptation, they kept going often, which took them from doing okay to doing sometimes fabulously. What else? We've got a range of studies around the critical infrastructure side. One of those is the economics of resilient infrastructure, which is its goal is to build an economic model that will provide a decision support system for New Zealand in terms of thinking about damage to infrastructure and how we should respond, the impact of that on the economy, hopefully tied through to other systems that would provide us impact on local communities. Some of the key learnings so far from that have been quite interesting. One of them is that Maori organizations were more impacted in Christchurch. Maori organizations have been more impacted than the average, and yet their recovery and their resilience was higher than the average. Don't ask me why. We don't know why yet. That's something we're going to have a look at. Another factor was that resilience has an ebb and a flow to it. You might start very resilient and have eroded because of what's been happening to you, and you have to reinvest in it. So that idea that resilience isn't something you just build and park and use when you need it, but it has an ebb and a flow to it, and you have to be working on it all the time. A range of other infrastructure projects. I mentioned to you the Resilient Expert Advisory Group that Erica is on. We're in the process, we hope, of doing a larger project in Australia. As a result of that connection, we conducted a Australian water industry study of their 5 most resilient water utilities, and some very interesting learnings from that. One of the key learnings was the thing they prepared the least for was the most damaging to most of them, and it was reputational crises. Not a water main break, which happens, or it usually had to do with a reputational impact that they had done no preparation for. It wasn't even on their radar. Quite an important feature to be thinking about. Another range of studies leading the resilient enterprise. And this piece of work has been quite a critical piece of work because through this 10 years, one of the things that's floated to the surface is that of our 13 indicators, leadership is the single most important one. It's the one that enables all the rest of the indicators or undermines them. It's the one thing that everyone can take responsibility for. The leadership isn't just about the CEO. Leadership is about the middle management who are critical in communicating with the staff in a crisis. Leadership is also about the person on the ground looking after, making sure that the piece that they're doing is being well done, not leaving it to somebody else to look after their piece of the action. And a lot of this has been tied to an initiative that's come out of leading and managing critical infrastructure organizations, and that's the employee resilience research. One of the things that we're particularly excited about with that is they've built a small set of questions that we're going to plug into our resilience monitoring tool, you could call it, our benchmark resilience tool. So we have a range of tools, and but I won't cover that. Erica, I think, is going to touch on that. So with that, Erica, I think I'll turn it over to you.
Well, 10 years. It seems like a long time ago that we very first started resilient organisations, but I think 10 years is a really important milestone to pause and reflect, because actually we need to look backwards and see how far we've managed to come over the past 10 years so that we can get a sense of actually how far we might be able to get within the next 10 years and set ourselves some stretch targets rather than just setting ourselves sort of small little goals of what we might be able to do. So let's cast our mind back to where we were in 2004 when we started. This was a very common sort of statistic that would be bandied around in the realms of business continuity management, etc. We would try and shock the businesses with fact. 80% of businesses affected by major incident closed within 18 months. You will have seen similar sorts of statistics like these. Well, they've pretty well been proven now that these are urban myths. And I actually found that statistic still sitting on a city council's website in various places around the world. So these statistics are lurking around there. But a lot of researchers have tried to go back and find the original source of these statistics, and they can't be found. They sort of, it's like trying to follow back to find the source of an urban myth. And we know innately that they're not true, because we know, even from our own personal experience within New Zealand, that many organisations don't get ready, but they do get through. Just think of the Auckland CBD that lost its power for about 4 or 5 weeks. And even here in Christchurch, we know that many of our businesses were woefully unprepared. I mean, if you've got to go back in and save a computer server, then some of the basics really haven't been done. And yet some of these organisations are able to get through. And so that was why we really set aside the task to try and find out, well, what are these indicators of resilience? And probably most importantly, what are some of the leading indicators of resilience? Rather than just getting to after a crisis and then being able to tick the box and say, well, that organisation was resilient and that one wasn't. Could we give organisations some tools so that they could try and evaluate in advance what their strengths and weaknesses would likely be in times of crisis? And one of the key things about those indicators is actually there's two aspects to an organisation's resilience. It needs to be planned. If you're not planned, then you're going to be fighting fires after a crisis. You're going to have to be going back into the building to rescue your computer servers, etc. But you also need to be adaptive, because no plan is ever going to fit with every kind of crisis. And as soon as the crisis is big enough, you need to plan. And so really organisations need an equal measure of being both planned and adaptive, and we need to find ways to engage organisations with that. But one of the key things now is actually providing organisations with tools so that they can evaluate where they actually sit on this. Each of our organisations will have its own sort of personality or resilience profile. If we can get them to recognise where they sit, then we can start to drive some improvement. And as John mentioned, we've started developing tools that organisations can use for evaluating where they actually sit against those 13 indicators. And the initial tool that Amy Stevenson developed has now been developed into an online tool called the Benchmark, or the Resilience Benchmark tool, which we recently used with Bay of Plenty the Bay of Plenty Lifelines group, so 18 critical infrastructure providers in the Bay of Plenty region. And they were able to assess where their organisations sat against those 13 indicators, but also how they compared to other critical infrastructure providers within that region. Nothing like a bit of an incentive to sort of raise the game within your own organisation. So if we think, well, if we've come that far within the past 10 years, where could we potentially get within the next 10 years? And I'm starting to feel a little bit confident that hopefully within the next 10 years, we will see organisations reporting on resilience as a key metric, in the same way that they report on their financial performance at the end of each year, that organisations will be proactively measuring and reporting on their resilience and how they're investing in that. If we cast our mind back to 2004 again, resilience was seen as an insurance policy. It was all about preparing for the big one, the thing that we didn't want to happen. But we're increasingly seeing a paradigm shift happening here, and I think over the next 10 years that paradigm shift is going to increase in pace. And we're starting to see resilience not so much as a grudge purchase, but actually resilience as an investment in being able to thrive, not just to survive. And by 2024, I think we'll start to see that resilience is actually about just being a better business. It's not about being a business that will get through the bad times. It will actually just be about being a good business. And when you think about it, that shouldn't be surprising, because if you look at these 13 indicators that we've got there, each one of those individually have been the topic of a lot of management research. They're just good management, but what we've done is actually pulled them all together to show how they're not only good about creating high-performing organisations, but they're also enabling your organisation to have a capability to deal with the unknown. Again, taking our mind back to 2004, our thinking was that business recovery is all about the dollars. Well, our thinking has definitely moved on from that. In 2024, we'll see business recovery as something much richer. It'll be about the people, about the social capital and the connections between our organisation and the interplay between our organisations and our communities in their recovery. And so we'll start to see organisations as a key linchpin in supporting the recovery of our communities following disaster. And by 2024, I hope that we'll start to see the shift to organisations practising resilience as a team sport. Resilience isn't a game where there can be one winner. Essentially, my organisation is dependent upon your organisation, and your organisation is dependent upon this community. We actually need to collectively raise the game for resilience, and I'm hoping that by 2024 we will actually see organisations taking up this mantle and being proactive in improving the resilience of other organisations that are operating within their space. So the last point of reflection I want to make is that really back in 2004 we felt that organisations needed to be sold the message of resilience, that this was a grudge purchase and we almost had to shake them and tell them that it was good medicine for them and to force them to take it. Well, I'm hoping that we're starting to see a change in this. And when we think that organisations are this keystone species within our communities, I'm hoping that over the next 10 years, we will actually start to harness the innovation, the resourcefulness, the ideas and the capabilities within our organisations, and actually start to see them as part of the solution for improving our community's resilience and not as part of the problem. So hopefully I'm not being over-optimistic. I think we can do it, and we need to mobilise you all to make sure that it happens within our communities. Thank you.